So the big industry push, because of the internet and cloud services, is to buy and use software as a service, right? Software as a service is a way of picking up functionality that you don't have to stand up, you don't have to have the expertise to manage, and it lets you try and focus more on the business side, the value add part of IT, or the value add part of your business with your customers. Because these systems take a lot of data and they provide a lot of power, I would argue with great power, there is great responsibility to make sure that those systems are doing the right thing for you, the tenant of those systems, or if you're building that system, to make sure that you're doing the right thing for your customers beyond just providing business functionality. So for the purposes of this discussion, I'm not going to ignore the business requirements. We're only going to talk about the non-functional requirements. I'm going to assume that the business owner and their delivery teams will figure out if it meets the business need, right? We wouldn't be looking at this if it didn't meet the needs. Or maybe we do the NFRs first, it's up to you. And then the architecture and operations and security are going to ensure or expose the NFRs, right? And try and understand, and either they or the teams will investigate that with the SaaS provider. And for the purposes of this, I'm going to assume there's always another provider that can meet our needs. If this was the only provider and we can't build it ourselves, that might be different. But generally, there's going to be other companies that can meet some portion of our needs, and we have to balance the functional requirements against the NFRs. So the main topics I'm going to talk about are control and data planes. We're going to talk about the fact that there's pretty much two control planes: the platform control plane owned by the SaaS provider, the tenant control plane, which is what you use as a customer to manage this software as a service for yourself, how you configure it, how you monitor it. And then there's the tenant data plane where the actual business operations occur. I'm butchering these terms from the network world, but a lot of people who aren't in network use these terms today. The next thing I'm going to talk about a little bit, we're going to cover, is data and tenant protection. How do you protect yourself both when they're running the system for you and when you terminate the agreement? And then we're going to talk about identity integration. I actually think that's a huge area you got to pay attention to. In small companies, it may not matter, but when you've got hundreds or thousands of employees using this thing, the overhead of that and the inaccuracies can really put you on the front page of the newspaper, or those don't exist anymore, barely. You'll be on the front page of the news wiki, or the electronic news, right? So let's go into that a little bit. We're going to start with data and control plane. So again, I'm going to say here, you're going to use three terms for the platform control plane, the tenant control plane, and the tenant data plane. And so for the platform control plane, the thing we really want to make sure is we want to understand what the platform and the tenant CP, control plane segregation, looks like. The functionality of those two control planes should be different and not much overlapping. And the tenant and the data control plane permissions, the roles that are allowed, can't even be assigned either by the vendor or to the vendor. Well, they usually can assign some top level role, and then you assign all the others. They shouldn't have visibility of that or any way to write to those configuration databases. And that's for their protection too. Then they don't have to worry about a data breach being initiated on the vendor side. That's what we're trying to protect ourselves from, or for the vendor, we want to protect ourselves from our own employees doing that, because that can give us a black eye and people will leave our business, right? That's bad. And that the tenant data is never visible in the platform control plane. There should be no way, zero opportunity for data to appear in the platform, the vendor's control plane, and metrics could appear, but not the data. In the tenant control plane, what we should have is features that are not available to the platform or to the provider. And that might be creating roles, assigning roles, creating new data sets, creating APIs, whatever. I might be able to build out in the control plane, build configuration that creates screens or does other things, and the platform should never be able to do that. And they shouldn't even really be able to see it, except maybe the size of the fact that they're there. And I would argue the control plane tiers have different roles. The tenant control plane team should have separate roles and should not be able to grab a role from the platform. And the tenant data isn't visible in the tenant CP, right? So none of the control planes should be able to see the data. And you'll find places where that's not really true, and then you got to decide whether you're going to allow that, whether that makes sense. And then last is the tenant data plane, and this is API and data at rest, so data in motion, data at rest. And the data should be protected by permissions not given to the provider and not given by the provider. They should give you permissions, and then you manage giving those permissions out in your system, or if you're the provider, then you give some initial permission and then you walk away from it. And that the tenant CP owns, tenant control plane owns managing the tenant space, right? The platform creates a tenant space and the tenant manages itself. So this one, I'm going to say a couple things in here. I'm actually believe that all my data should be encrypted with my own keys, and those keys should be revocable. This is actually, when products aren't designed to be tenant, truly tenant, they have some issues with this. If they were designed to be single tenant on-prem originally, and then they move to the cloud, man, they get burned on this, and there are other places, that all the data encryption should be done with the customer keys, right? Data at rest should be with the customer keys, and the customer key should be set up in a way that if I revoke access to that key, the application for that tenant just stops working. And there are a lot of places you don't see this, and people are willing to move with that. But what that means is if you terminate the agreement, that company still has your data. And actually, they probably can still run your system, right? Whereas if you have revocable keys, then they can't, even if they could see how you configured it, they can't use it. And so the goal here is a tenant should be able to kill the system from their own control plane or from their own space. I feel like this is a big deal. Worked one place where we understood this, and it was a request from the customer, and I really liked the fact we were working on how to make that happen. And actually, I work with a large SaaS provider that's capable of doing that. So it's going to be done if the people take it seriously. The next one is authorization integration. What we really want to do is we want the data tier to provide group identity integration. We want it to be able to integrate with the tenant's authorization role assignments. And so there may be roles in the platform, and then you want to be able to bind those against roles and capabilities, roles and identity definitions from the tenant, right? And what we'd like to have is the data tier. I'm going to assume that we have authentication working. That's the simple one. I think the harder one is getting authorization integration working, because what we want to be able to do is turn off somebody's permission if they leave a group. And we don't really want to have to go out to that system to make it happen. We want to follow our normal processes. And if I drop somebody, they get dropped in the other system, right? Somebody could walk off with temporary credentials if it isn't built right. But what we want to be able to do is revoke any authorization they had. And we're going to try and revoke their authentication also, obviously. But we should do it in authentication and authorization. The other thing is we really need to verify the tenant isolation. The data and APIs need to be isolated in a way that if one tenant totally blows up their config and leaks all their data, that there's no way to back channel or side channel from that tenant into your tenant. And that what we really want is we want regular audit results. Like this kind of blows my mind too. The best SaaS provider I work with is a cloud data warehouse vendor, and they provide quarterly audit results, and they talk about what they're doing to increase their security and protect us, and increase their isolation from their team and from our team. And I think that is freaking amazing. And those are, you got to pay attention to that. You can always do a trade-off, but you need to ask the questions. So the last one here on the three main points was identity integration. And so I covered authorization a little bit on the previous topic. Here we're really talking about who somebody is, right? And what we want is identity provider integration. We want real-time authentication integration. I'd really prefer not to have hard credentials built into this system that are separate from my primary system. As a matter of fact, it's a major security hole. Work plenty of places where we left credentials working when somebody left the company or somebody terminated a relationship, and it was because the identity providers weren't wired together correctly, and you had to, people didn't know somebody in the system. We need an efficient role synchronization system, and we really want this tenant to look like any other app in the company. It needs to be integrated with permission request and approval process at a large company. If it's a small company, it may be fine, but even then the cloud providers tend to provide like Azure AD or something, and you really want this thing to be integrated with that, so you only have one process. Because isolated identity providers are a weakness. I went through a couple security reviews where we had isolated or manual identity providers on an island, and the results were always bad. There are always bad processes in those and weaknesses in them, separate from the fact that they never got cleaned up when people changed roles. And the last one here is really just provider integration. The provider should be highly integrated with the system that they build. So if I'm the SaaS provider, the permissions should all work through my request and management system, and there should be no, I just provisioned this, and there should be no way to provide hard credentials or individuals' credentials in any of the control planes for any of the software that you rent out to other people. So the last one here is you are entrusting your company's data and reputation to this provider. You need to hold them accountable. they do this for a living. If they don't view that they protect your data and process for a living, then you need to seriously rethink that. And so that's really all I'm going to cover for today. The goal here is to give you a short checklist for SaaS providers that are outside of the does it meet my company needs? Are they a big name? Can they hold our data? Those type of things. I hope this is useful. Have a great day.